Welcome to Teaching Truth. Nestling in the beauty of Royal Deeside is the village of Ballater. Ballater being just a stone's throw from Balmoral Castle. And if you visit Ballater, and in particular Davidson's Pharmacy or Sheridan's Butcher, you will see a crest above the door, a royal crest which reads, "By royal appointment." And that royal crest and those words signify and indicate that those establishments have been specially selected, hand-picked to serve the royal court, to serve the king when he is at Balmoral Castle. By royal appointment. Joseph was specially selected, and Joseph was, as it were, hand-picked by Pharaoh to interpret the dreams which he had had. By royal appointment, Joseph was taken from the prison into the palace. By royal appointment is the theme for our reflections this week. And in our reflections today, we want to think about the providence of God, the providence of God that we read of in the narrative of Genesis 41. First of all, we want to think about the providential delays that there were. You see, in the passage, we read that Joseph languished and remained behind bars in the prison for 2 full years. 24 months, 104 weeks. The butler had been released, but yet Joseph remained in prison. And yet I believe that God used those long, grinding months and years as Joseph was behind bars to teach Joseph patience and dependence. God had placed Joseph, as it were, in a holding pattern. A holding pattern that he would, through that holding pattern, learn some very important lessons before God brought him, as it were, into land. And it may well be today that you feel that your life is in a bit of a holding pattern. Like an aeroplane, you feel as if you're going round and round in circles. You're not getting anywhere. God's forgotten about you. But hear this, God hadn't forgotten about Joseph. God was in absolute control. Providential delays were part of God's plan. Providential delays are never easy, but they're designed to focus our faith and increase our dependence upon the Lord. There were also providential dreams. We read that the dreams which Pharaoh had caused him much concern. Verse 8 tells us that he was troubled. Now that particular word, troubled, has the idea of being disturbed or greatly distressed. And so what did Pharaoh do? Well, what Pharaoh did was that he called for his wise men, and these were men who were supposed to be able to communicate with the so-called Egyptian gods and share with Pharaoh the counsel of these gods. But guess what? These wise men were not wise enough in that they could not interpret the dreams either. You see, God, I believe, had closed their minds and caused them to draw a blank in this matter. To be a counselor without counsel, to be a wise man without wisdom in those days, before the ruler and particularly before Pharaoh, was a dangerous thing. And so these providential dreams which Pharaoh had, are all part of God's orchestrated plan, working behind the scenes in order that Pharaoh would call on Joseph, the only one who could interpret the dreams. God was working behind the theatre curtain, as it were, to accomplish his plan and purpose. You see, Pharaoh and his wise men thought that they were in control of everything that was happening, but God was in absolute control. God was in absolute control. Providential dreams. But there was also providential deliverance, because the chief butler finally realizes that there is a man in prison called Joseph. He remembers him, as it were, from 2 years ago. And he tells Pharaoh the story of his own experience of how Joseph had interpreted the dream which he had had. And so Pharaoh thinks, well, if Joseph interpreted the dream for you, Joseph surely will be able to interpret the dream for me. And therefore, by royal appointment, Joseph is delivered from the prison and he's brought to the palace. Joseph is brought to Pharaoh. Joseph is brought to the palace, but only once Pharaoh has been brought to a place of desperation. On any other day, such a powerful ruler, such a king, would not have listened to anything a prisoner had to say to him. But on this day, God had humbled Pharaoh. On this day, Pharaoh had no choice. He was desperate for answers, and he was willing to listen to anyone who could possibly give them to him. And Joseph was the only one who could do that. Joseph was providentially delivered from behind bars. And often when we want to see something happen, we want it now. We live in a world of instant news, instant coffee, instant many other things. But we need to learn that God so often orders events and the very timing of these events according to his timing, according to his perfect will. And so here we see in Joseph's life the providence of God, the hidden hand of God at work. As Joseph is brought from the prison to the palace by royal appointment. Join me tomorrow in Teaching Truth as we look at Pharaoh.